Welcome back to a new season of The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comet Magazine. I'm your host, Dan Snyder, and today is the first episode of a season exploring the question of social change. How does it happen? Is there a pattern of ingredients we can retrospectively see activated at its beginning? Is redemptive social change of the healing, uniting variety still possible throughout North America? If so, what would it take to strengthen that current? With me to get us out of the gate is someone who's written a lot about social and cultural change and who's also done his best, when prompted, to move beyond his vocation as a writer into community organizing. At times, you might even say movement building. That person happens to be my husband, David Brooks, and he's graciously agreed to bring some of the muses from our dinner table to you. David is many things, but professionally, he's served as a longtime columnist for the New York Times. He's authored several best-selling books, including Bobos in Paradise, The Social Animal, The Road to Character, and The Second Mountain. He's a beloved commentator on the PBS NewsHour on Fridays and the founder of Weave, the social fabric project at the Aspen Institute. He's also, if I may, a uniquely careful listener to people, to cultural currents, to the lessons of history, and increasingly to the whispers of the Holy Spirit. It's a joy to share this person that I so love and admire with you, our listeners. And I hope you walk away feeling invigorated by a season and a set of questions animated ultimately by hope. Welcome to the Whole Person Revolution, David. Look at that familiar face.
It's good to be here. It's weird to be podcasting with somebody who already knows everything about me.
Wow.
I can't do my George Santos make up a new life shtick that I was planning on.
Well, I don't know. You could maybe try a few things that I don't normally hear. It's somehow vulnerability can come out when there's a public listening. So thank you for joining us. We, as you've heard me talk about at our dinner table, Comment is looking at all things social change, how it happens, why it feels sort of harder to control and usher forth in some overly strategic, designed top-down way, and how has it happened in the past, and what can we learn from those ingredients, even if technology is so different now and many dynamics are different? Are there some underlying factors? So for a variety of reasons, I thought you would be the perfect guest to actually get us out of the gate, because you've thought about this both from the outside as an observer, but also as someone who has attempted here and there to be an agent of change, both small and large. And I just thought your honesty on all that would be a gift to our listeners. I would love a little autobiography for our listeners. Do you think you've always, at some level, been poking around this notion of change, whether in an individual's own life or in a broader society and civilization?
I guess so. I identify as a writer. Age 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear and decided that instant I wanted to be a writer. Write books like that. And I've been writing books or writing almost every day, as you know, from about 8 a.m. till about 1 p.m., 7 days a week, roughly 365 days a year. It's very hard to be married to such a person.
No comment.
But, there's a great essay that George Orwell wrote called Why I Write. And he said, the first reason I write is I want people to think I'm clever. The second reason is because I like to play around with words. And the third is I want to change things. And I think we all write for all those three reasons. And so I do think writers are the real drivers of change. I'm a cultural determinist. I think culture shapes everything. And it's not only writers who shape culture, but all the people who shape culture are the ones who shift the way people see the world. And you can't have change unless you have a cultural change first.
So you think in some of your ambitions to be a writer, you felt like it was an important role?
Yeah, I mean, when I was in college, I hung around the stacks. We had a library where you could wander around. And I hung around the magazines from the 1930s. And I fell in love with the New Republic. And I left college thinking all of 20th century history was determined in the offices of the New Republic magazine. And that was a little true. Walter Lippmann, some of the people who were there really helped form the progressive movement, which then they were pivotal in the New Deal, pivotal in the Great Society. And so it was in those little magazines. And then when I was 23 or so, I worked for Bill Buckley. And there was really no conservative movement. In 1945, Lionel Trilling famously said, "There are no conservative ideas in America." Bill went to Yale, wrote a book about how Yale was so liberal, and eventually founded National Review. And without National Review and a few other magazines like that, there was no conservative movement. There's no Ronald Reagan. Alas, there was no Republican Party as we know it today. And people read National Review in part for the ideas, but not really. Mostly they read it because they wanted to be around Bill Buckley. He had this incredibly magnetic and charismatic personality and a way of being. He was erudite, glamorous, aggressive. And he taught me another thing about social change, which is that leaders create moral ecologies around them. And the rest of us are we want to be admired by the people we admire. So we behave and think in the way they admire. And so the other person who did this for me was Jim Lehrer. And I tell the story of how my first 10 years as a pundit on the PBS NewsHour, if I said something sort of cheap and shoddy, his mouth would downturn with displeasure. If I said something witty and nice and intelligent, his eyes would crinkle with pleasure. And so for 10 years, I tried to chase the eye crinkle and avoid the mouth downturn. And that's a way he created a whole moral ecology. And it wasn't just for me, it was for everybody who worked at the NewsHour. Well, he's been dead for a number of years now, but the PBS culture is still really shaped by the standards and the way of being he personified, which we all copied. And creating a moral ecology is one way to create change.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I mean, I'm laughing, and I feel like that's how a lot of us treat emojis now in text and all sorts of relationships, depending on the dynamic, friendship, professional relationship, an acquaintance we don't know well but want to. We chase the smiley faces, not the frowns.
Yeah. And that's even changed. Like, I used to talk normally, but now when I'm texting or even emailing, now I'm exclamation point every other word. If it's not an exclamation point, I'm being rude to the person. So my norms have been shifted by
Well, was this a Buckley rule about exclamation points? Wasn't there a prohibition on them? There was some famous line. Am I misremembering?
I do think that's true. I think he come from a generation where you rarely talked about yourself in the first person in a column. You didn't use exclamation points, and now we're all, of course, just a bunch of spiller guys.
Yeah, so we've what do you call it when you grade people on a curve?
Happiness inflation.
I just want to thank you for bringing up this notion of moral ecology, which we'll get more into in this conversation, I anticipate. But it's funny, I think part of my own choosing of this rather unwieldy theme and to devote 2 quarters, so essentially 6 months of a year to it historically and in the contemporary context is out of my own work, largely working with philanthropists and foundations, but also kind of being yoked into more certain kinds of, I would say, progressive coalitions who are all like wringing their hands about the state of the world. I mean, that's happening on all sides of the political spectrum, but I would say both the combination of kind of an elite progressivism and then a certain sort of contemporary philanthropic driven desire to change things rarely puts the power of a person there. I mean, they'll believe in particular leaders. They may go after certain kinds of charismatic individuals, but somehow it often feels very scientific and sort of de-souled, S-O-U-L, and they're not actually thinking about this power that we're all just attracted to something or someone we want to be around. And it's more this like process of attraction to a way of being and a way of life then that could eventually affect how we treat climate change. But I somehow that sort of more moral, almost personality, spiritual terrain is rarely brought into the calculus. So
yeah, I mean, it's odd that progressives don't think this way because this is how modern progressivism was founded. In the 1950s, there was disquiet at not only racial injustice, but mostly about cultural stagnation and boredom. People thought everybody was too conformist. So there was opposition to that, but nobody knew how to change it. And I would say that the key moment came in the early 60s when a group of students led by Tom Hayden gathered in Port Huron, Michigan, and created the Port Huron document. And this is in the early 60s. And what they did was they created over a series of days this manifesto, but that wasn't really what was important. What was important was they created this magical community and a way of being. And so the hippies sort of grew out of this. Bob Dylan was part of the ethos. And suddenly people thought, those Woodstock, the Flower Children, they're kind of cool. Bob Dylan is kind of cool. And that had a cultural side, but it also eventually had a political side, the civil rights, anti-war. And so I think the modern progressivism really rose to power. Really, not as in the 30s, it was mostly about policy. It was about the New Deal. But since the 60s, it's mostly been about a set of values. And it arose out of I think, if you look at the Port Huron statement, maybe it was 62 or 63, pretty much modern progressivism is written in that manifesto.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, and that shift to values has had both a positive and negative impact on our politics, I would argue. You've mentioned a few movements already, but do you have sort of a go-to inspirational ideal you look to historically as sort of the paragon example of a cultural shift?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are many. I mean, the Beau ideal is the early church. I mean, when I founded this Weave project, we just looked at what the early church did and we tried to do everything they did. So we had a manifesto like they had gospel. We had small groups. They had small groups. We had evangelists. They had evangelists. I mean, we just copied. And then the person closer to our present time who I once wrote about was this guy, Stewart Brand. And so he changed the world twice. And so he grew up in the 30s in Illinois, and he was bored with his conservative suburban world. And he had an idea in the early 50s, must have been the 60s, that we were sending rockets off into space for the first time. And he said, the cameras are always pointed at the moon. Why don't we turn the camera around and point it at the Earth? Because there had never been a picture of the whole Earth. And so he got a petition, NASA did it. It produced this iconic photo, which is like core to the environmental movement now. And then he put it on the cover of a magazine called the Whole Earth Catalog, which came out in, I guess, the late 60s. It sold 2.5 million copies, won a National Book Award.
Oh, my goodness.
And the Whole Earth Catalog was meant to help you. If you wanted to form a hippie commune, these were the tools you're going to need. And these were the writers you should be reading. It was a whole life guide to how to be countercultural.
And it was it was like an almanac. It wasn't a sequential magazine. It was there's one Whole Earth catalog.
It was like an annual almanac. It was sort of like, but you get ads for like a shovel or seeds or flax clothing or whatever. And so that really magnetized the movement. And so the hippies grew out of Stewart Brand. And so then it turns out the commune movement didn't work because farming is hard. And so he decided in the early 70s, well, farming isn't cool. You know what's cool? Computers are cool. And he was living out in what is now Silicon Valley. And in those days, computers were thought of as the ultimate IBM corporate thing. He said, no, computers can be countercultural. And so he wrote a piece for Rolling Stone on the culture of the hackers and the concept of sort of bad boy software rebels in black T-shirts. And Steve Jobs, whose favorite book in the world was the Whole Earth Catalog, got together with Bill Gates and others, and they formed another magical community in Silicon Valley, the Homebrew Computing Club or whatever it's called. And so the Silicon Valley world that we know as Apple, that was too out of Stewart Brand. So it was that process of naming a different ideal that created these two cultural movements that we see today.
You mentioned Weave, and I would like for you to, if you wouldn't mind, I think a lot of our listeners are actually familiar with the identity of a weaver, partly shock of shocks. I use it a lot. And I think it's actually great credit to you, David, has become more a part of just common vocabulary as people think about basically what it is to be a good neighbor, but not just in your neighborhood context, in all sorts of contexts, your professional context, perhaps your religious institution that you're a part of, any sort of voluntary association, that this is a way of being. So could you just illuminate, the listeners may kind of have an intuition around what a weaver is and love to identify as one, what sort of led you to start this project called Weave, which wound up being inspired by the work of Stewart Brand as a theory of cultural change?
Well, it started because every column I was writing for the Times came down to underneath social dysfunction, the breakdown in our social fabric, high levels of distrust, high levels of polarization, just sort of the relational crisis that we find ourselves in. And it occurred to me that this problem is being solved on the local level by weavers. And a weaver is anybody who is involved in creating deeper relationships in their community. And it could be through an organization, through a nonprofit. We have a friend, Pancho, who's been on this podcast, who used to run something called Living Hope Wheelchair Association, which helps disabled men get wheelchairs, live dignified lives. Or it could just be somebody who is just one of those people who's the person in the neighborhood everybody knows. And so we would go into a town and say, who's trusted here? And they would always name a few people who are just the people who are organized the community. And there was a lady in Florida, one of our people interviewed, who they met her. She was helping children leave school, cross the street after elementary school in the afternoon. And the guy asked her, do you have time to volunteer in your community? And she said, no. And he said, well, are you getting paid for this? And she says, no, I just help the kids across the street. And then he said, well, what are you doing after this? And she said, well, on Thursdays, I take food to the hospital so that people can have nice food. And he said, again, do you have time to volunteer? And she said, no, I have no time. So she didn't see that as volunteering. That was just what a neighbor was. And so those are weavers. And my one sentence for this whole hour, my one sentence summary of social change is: change happens when a small group of people find a better way to live and the rest of us copy them. And so I thought the weavers were just these amazing people. We've met so many of them, and they found a better way to live. And we should all set them up as exemplars that we can copy. And so what the first job of Weave, the organization, was to create an identity. And so we came up with this word weaver. And we thought if there's an identity of a weaver, that'll be powerful. So, for example, in 1955, nobody said, I'm a feminist. But by 1975, millions and millions of people said, I'm a feminist. And it gave them an identity, a set of values, a set of ideas, and it created a widespread change. And so we were hoping to rally cultural change around this identity. That was really the first task. And the problem we faced and why we focused on identity and norms was that, as a friend of ours, Howard Husak, once said to us, we need to build relationships, but relationships don't scale. They take a long time to develop. They're one-on-one, but norms scale. If you can shift the norms and manners of a society, then you can really see cascading change all at once. And one of the things successful movements do is they declare something disgraceful. So the civil rights movement declared segregation disgraceful, the Me Too movement, sexual abuse disgraceful, and even some of the conservative cultural change agents declared pornography disgraceful. And when you do that, you say, that's intolerable to us. And suddenly it becomes socially painful to behave in this bad way. And you've rearranged people's incentives in their eyes, and suddenly they're not going to litter the way they used to freely litter without thinking about it.
Yeah, and Weave still exists and is doing really good work, I think, especially around trust, although David is not as directly involved anymore. Or you are not directly involved. I should speak to you in the second person. But I do think that identity at least has been, it's not like you were creating something, you were just naming something and holding up something. And I think there's something there to pay attention to, that which we name. Fear has power today. We see that in our politics. I think a lot of us increasingly worry that coherent movements seem only possible if a fear or resentment is named that is given an explanatory narrative. But in your case, you were trying to name something that I think, regardless of political attachment or even social class or race or anything else, was more a set of character traits than anything else that reflects some of the most beloved people in our lives. And could a coherent movement build as a result of a hopeful ideal? And I still cling to that as just a model worth following, though I think this broader notion of culture change is much thornier than it maybe used to be, or maybe it's always been thorny, and it's just we'll never be able to fully wrap our arms around it. So something you said around norms, and even quoting Howard Husak there, is just prompting this question. Why does it seem like our norms, let's just say in our own American or North American societies, it feels like they are more dictated by every new technological move and advance rather than a moral ideal or a shared story. And we all know we don't really have so much of a shared story anymore. But it sort of feels like we're helpless. It's like human beings have lost their agency and we kind of are just helpless before everything that's accelerating and shifting our habits. We're just responsive, but there's no actual kind of like moral muscle or strain that is captivating us enough to sort of stand athwart, unless you're talking about wellness and wholeness and boundaries. Like there's some things that people will say that kind of people are putting a stake in the sand, like I'm going to reject social media for now, or not allow my boss to work me 24/7 or whatever it is, but they still tend to be in the negative, and I wouldn't say they're rooted necessarily in a comprehensive moral vision. So do you agree with me there that it kind of feels like our norms are actually not even particularly created by a positive vision of the good by us anymore?
Yeah, this is my obsession. I'll quote another friend of ours, James Davison Hunter at UVA, who says that America's culture is defined by a lack, and it's a lack of moral formation. That if you go back in most of American history, our founders thought people were basically wonderful, but also quite sinful. And if we're going to have a decent society, we have to work on people making people a little better than they are. And so they were morally formative institutions spread across society. It was obviously the churches and the synagogues, but every school, they had courtesy clubs, they had thrift clubs. The schools saw their job as the formation of moral human beings. And they were really very specific about how they did it. And they had high ideals. I always quote this guy who was headmaster of the Stowe School in the 1920s. I think it was up in Vermont. He said, we try to raise young men who are acceptable at a dance, invaluable at a shipwreck. And so that's the kind of character they were trying to do. I wrote a chapter in a book, The Road to Character, on Frances Perkins, who went to Mount Holyoke, and it formed her into being a true public servant, and formed many, many, many young women to go become missionaries all around the world. And so that happened across society. And Sunday school movement, the YMCA. And then sometime, I think around 1945, we stopped doing it. And the churches and synagogues still try, but the schools got out of the character formation business. They got into the let's get you into Harvard and Yale business, or let's train you to become an accountant business. The universities got out of that business. My Yale colleague, Tony Kronman, wrote a book saying universities were about what he called the humanistic ideal, which was forming better people. Now they're about the research ideal, which is doing research and getting journal articles. And they've become sort of amoral. And so in my view, we've now had several generations, many of whom have, they're not immoral people, but they're morally inarticulate because they've been never given the categories to think in. And even words like sin, redemption, grace, it's hard to know what's going on in your moral self if you don't have those words or know how to apply them. And to me, moral formation seems like big and pretentious, but it's really about three simple things. One, it's helping people find ways to restrain their natural selfishness. Second, it's about holding up an ideal so you'll pursue something truly excellent. And third, it's how to be considerate in the small acts of daily life, how to break up with someone without breaking their heart, how to ask for forgiveness, how to notice somebody in a room who's filled with anxiety and try to ease their pain. And so it's these practical things. And, there's now a book by Christian Smith that came out maybe 5-10 years ago called Lost in Transition. He interviews a bunch of college students, and they're good kids. They're like every generation, but they don't know how to think in moral terms. A lot of them just say, I don't really think about that much. And then we have another friend, Christy Nemba, who more recently wrote a book called Rethinking Sex. And she interviews young people in their 20s about their sex lives. And again, they don't have the categories to think. They know that hooking up feels bad, but they don't know why. And there's a woman in the book that it was so sad who was raped. And she said, I know being raped is worse than getting burgled, but I really don't know why. And so it's just this lack of moral formation that I think pervades society and is one of the reasons I think we have so much sadness and meanness in society. And when you leave people a void, they're going to fill the void. And I think people fill the void in two big ways. One, politics. Politics seems to give you a moral system. It gives you allegedly good versus evil, our team versus their team. It gives you something to do, to be emotionally angry and outraged at the other team. And so it seems moral, but it's not really belonging. It's not really community. And then technology. And technology seems to give you a set of ways to interact with people, but you're not learning the social skills on TikTok. You're not learning how to break up with somebody, how to build a friendship. And so I do think technology and politics have become our two placebos or attempts to fill what's really a void, a social void in moral formation.
Is that, so you kind of are critiquing politics and technology vis-a-vis kind of the lack of moral formation. And as we've shared before, as you've shared with me, even, certain very, very smart people who are very well educated and are operating in some of the more sort of elite vehicles of public opinion don't even know what moral formation is as like a phrase. It's a foreign concept. And maybe you disagree with me, but I would say, a lot of us all graduate with this sort of change the world message drummed into our heads and given a sense that you have a bit of agency to play in that. And there isn't always, in my case, there actually was a positive moral vision that was giving any notion of change some like direction and compass. But I think a lot of people don't actually even have that. They just have a sense of, certain particular choices of justice. There's certain issues. But in general, it feels like we're in a time when what I would call redemptive, uniting social change, moral and social change at kind of a large visible level feels almost impossible, or at least it hasn't happened, I would say, since the civil rights movement. And that's not to say there haven't been successful social movements. There have been quite a few movements that have, quote, succeeded, and even at the legal level, but I wouldn't say that they've necessarily garnered unity in the society. They've tended to just lead to further factionalism and distrust and kind of people batten down the hatches. Whereas I view the civil rights movement, of course, as imperfect and a kind of 1.0, but at least as what was part of that beautiful story was a lot of conversions, like lowercase c, in people's own attitudes of what they understood to be acceptable moral behavior and suddenly what they understood to be repugnant vis-a-vis race. So I'm just wondering, are you still going to criticize politics and technology as part of why someone like me feels like widespread, like a wave that we can all actually be intrigued by, compelled by, and join up with in a healthy way that winds up leading to healthier institutions and so on? Are those two part of why it feels so elusive, or is it broader forces or equally broad forces like ever proliferating pluralism and everything just feels so much more complicated now and we're aware of the complexities?
I think I'd say there have been small victories and small and medium-sized victories. So The Me Too movement, I think, is a clear victory against sexual abuse. Bill Drayton is a guy who founded Ashoka, right?
Ashoka. Mm-hmm.
And he created this identity. Talk about identity. He created social entrepreneur to make doing good seem kind of cool, and millions of young people and not so young people go off around the world and become social entrepreneurs and do good. So I think there's a whole series of small successful models that people can take part in. And I should emphasize that the most inspiring, I think, for both of us have always been local. And I think it's just, the Weavers are all very hyper local and
committed to that local.
Very committed. And, and my view is that people unite around things they love. And it's sometimes children. We all love our children, but it's usually a town or a neighborhood. And I found during the Weave work that the people in the neighborhood know what the neighborhood needs. They might need outside money, but they don't need outside expertise. And so if part of Weave's effort was to rally them around, support them, and frankly, make them famous, I'm not despairing, but I would say one thing. It's very hard to do the kind of big positive social change that's needed now in a culture that's hyper individualistic. And so one of the big ways I've come to understand social change is by reading a book called The Upswing by Robert Putnam and Shaylin Romney Garrett, who used to work at Weave. And they're basically, it's a whole bunch of charts that form a bell curve. Listeners can imagine a bell curve. So in the 1890s, we had all these terrible social trends: inequality, corruption, just social breakdown, crime. And then they get better. And they get better. All these different social trends get better until about 1955, 1965. And then suddenly they start getting worse again. And the bottom slope of the bell curve is still happening today. And so it's all these disparate trends like inequality, race relations, gender equality, political polarization, civic activism, things that you would think would be unrelated. They all follow the same curve. And so why is that? It's because they're all driven by cultural changes. And in those years, we had a lot of different Republican administrations, Democratic administrations, and they didn't make much difference to the curves. And then when I would go around to, especially to donors, I would say, look at this downward slope of the slide we've been on since 1965 in all these social indicators. And I would say, during these years, you people at the Rockefeller Foundation, at the Ford Foundation, you are giving away billions of dollars to try to do social change, and you did not bend the curve. And I would say that's because you didn't focus on cultural change first and foremost. And so I asked Putnam these days, okay, we've been on the downward slope with all the trends going in the wrong direction. And can we begin to see, have we hit bottom and are we moving up another curve? And he says he doesn't yet see it. I'm a little more optimistic. I think we've hit bottom.
I'm shocked. David Brooks, optimistic? Oh.
I have a piece in the Atlantic called The American Rebound. People can look it up. It's filled with data and very hard practical evidence to support this, my belief.
Well, we'll take your hope any day. It's why we all love you. Well, thank you for all that. I do really appreciate you reminding me of the small and medium incremental shifts, which I don't deny as, positive steps forward. I think just so often we see these counter reactions that feel ferocious, that discourage any sense that a positive shift could be implemented wisely across all of our institutions. So I think more about that kind of I'm thinking of Me Too and some of the ways it can be abused and so on. Again, this gets to moral formation in human beings.
Yeah. One thing, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the civil rights versus the movements of today. And the civil rights movement, they all formed these organizations which had these awkward acronyms, CORE and SNAP, and, all that kind of stuff. And I think now, if you look at the successful change organizations, BLM or Me Too or Occupy Wall Street, I guess, they're movements without leaders, and they're also movements without hierarchical structures. And I think if you talk to the smart people like Henry Timms, who you've had on, they understand you have to have decentralized authority, but you also have to have some sort of old style hierarchical structure. And so there's Henry, I think, taught me this phrase, optimal distinctiveness, which is you want to create an organization to which you belong, but these days you need to give people a chance to be distinct in the organization. So, for example, TED did a very smart thing. They said, we're not going to be the only TED conference organizers. We'll have TEDx, and you can organize your local TED conference. And that way you're all part of this thing called TED, but you can be TED Boston or TED Austin or whatever, TED Charleston, and you can create your own slightly different version of it. And that's optimal distinctiveness. And that's thinking about your organization and your systems in more creative ways, I guess.
Yeah, that's good. And that kind of sings to some of today's values. In some ways, people won't want to hear this. Not everyone will want to hear this, but the Boy Scouts actually did that too. They're not always famous for that. But if you read into the materials, they were highly conscious on sort of the creative agency they were giving all their local chapters. And that was a key ingredient to their own success. There was sort of like shared universal principles, but then it was all about what you're going to do in your context, and a little fun competition set in as well between chapters. So it's an interesting kind of psychological turn.
Alcoholics Anonymous is the classic version.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, on that note of hierarchy and institutions and lack of leaders in today's movements that have made gains, it's an interesting thing that I often think about vis-a-vis the organization that publishes Comment, and therefore this podcast, Cartus, which is a think tank, as you know. our tagline is sort of renewing North American social architecture, and that's kind of a fancy phrase, but embedded within that quote social architecture is a deep value of civil society and a deep value of institutions, largely traditional, the family, religious institutions, voluntary associations, all sorts of community centers, and then also valuing the role of the nation and the culture of a nation, and a little bit of, I would say, soft P today, patriotism embedded in that, and how the individual flows between all those that sort of web. And I love that I work for an organization that values that. I, of course, love institutions as well, at least theoretically. But I have just been wondering lately, okay, we're in the business of trying to reimagine and strengthen that middle web between the state and the individual. And I don't ever want to give up on that. But are those, except for the workplace, which I do think is probably more than ever a very formative place, especially for young people, given just how many hours people devote to their work these days, are those institutional cultures, and then thinking more broadly about national and civilizational cultures, as potent a force in our lives? Like, is that the ecology we should be thinking if we want to be in the business of renewing, regenerating, all those words? Should we be investing there, or should we be honest about the fact that actually it is TikTok and some sort of form of social media? Or, like, I guess the question is, what ecology are we actually a part of, at least right now? And should we be honest about that and seek to put more of our attention there?
Yeah, well, the technologies are just platforms, and they have their own distinct cultures, but they don't have to be determined if we're talking on podcast. And so, Cardus strikes me as a very coherent moral ecology. It's, if you go into the offices, it feels a certain way. If you read the reports, it feels a certain way. If you read comment, it feels a certain way. And so comment can be spread across TikTok or Twitter or Facebook or podcasts or in the printed magazine. And it's exemplifying a way of being. And so I just think whatever era you're in, small magazines are really powerful because they're distinctive in the way big magazines just aren't. And small communities are distinctive, that are not afraid to be themselves, are distinctive. And then the second thing, as you mentioned, Cardus weirdly does both these things. It tries to influence legislation, and it also, at comment and in other ways, tries to influence how people think about their lives. But I think they're related cultural ways of doing cultural change. And so I'm reminded of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the late senator from New York and true intellectual, had a phrase: the central conservative truth is that culture matters most. The central liberal truth is that government can change culture. And so you pass the Civil Rights Act, you're changing culture, you're changing people's ideas. And so I see it all part of the way you can shift norms. And I feel I also should say that I'm emphasizing culture so much, and it sounds like the only people who do social change are like writers and actors and publicists and things like that. And I learned the hard way that being able to write doesn't mean you can do everything that's required for social change. Like when I went to Weave, I had to be an administrator and a manager and do budgets and stuff like that. And I learned I'm really not very good at that. And so there are these different roles where people work together. I once wrote a column listing the different roles who are different kinds of social change agents. And one of them are the namers, the people who name what's wrong. And those are mostly writers. Then there are the walkouts, the people who leave corrupt systems and they want to protest. So they leave and defect and turn against the corrupt systems. Then there are confrontationalists, the people who are really angry and calling out injustice. And, I don't know who would, Malcolm X would be, frankly, an example of that. And people like me who are always into civility and all that kind of stuff, I have to give credit to the confrontationalists. They perform a necessary role to shake things down. Then there are illuminators who are like pointing to the change and saying, this is what we need, and just sort of spreading the gospel. And then there are conveners, people who bring people together and create these magic communities. And there are systematizers, the people who create networks and organizations and systems. So, for example, one social change agent was the Democratic Leadership Council, which took the Liberal Democratic Party and made it a little more moderate. And that was really pioneered by a guy named Al Fromm, who just built organizations of centrist Democrats. And that's its own skill. It's not just like writing.
Right. So I think you're a namer and an illuminator. I think you're a bit of both.
Yeah.
What am I?
I'm not a systematizer. You've become a systematizer now. That
Have I? I don't know. I think I might say a namer and convener. I don't know.
Yeah, and an illuminator. But you've, because of your role as editor, you're like building teams.
Well, I'm learning how to use Excel very late in life. And on another funny note, I would love to hear, I don't know if you have an inspiration on the spot, but if you have any choreography advice for like a comment TikTok, just reference Burt Cardis TikTok,
yeah.
I would be very intrigued as to how you would advise.
I see the Dougie is sort of out of fashion, but you could get me to dust off my moonwalking skills.
Oh, okay. Hey, folks, you heard it here. We're going to keep you to that. Give you a little hat on top, a Paddington the Bear set of overalls. This is going to go viral. So, okay, let's see. I wanted to ask something use a little bit more, actually, speaking of Cardis, the kind of language we might use. There's this, in fact, James Davison Hunter coined it some years ago in his very well-read book, To Change the World, which was published in 2010 and had a big influence on how people of Christian faith in particular were kind of revisiting long-standing theories of what it means to be salt and light in a broader, more secular society. Where are the levers of influence? And Hunter's essential thesis was that we need to have more appreciation for elite institutions and not ignore them altogether. And I think he was criticizing in part a longstanding kind of American evangelical tilt towards sort of populist assumptions and populism and politics together. And he was saying, wait a second, there's some other critical institutions that actually have a ton of influence. So anyways, be that as may, it continues to stir debate. I think there's a lot of talk in our circles. Could Hunter please revisit that thesis and, massage it according to all that has occurred in the last 12 to 14 years? He uses this word or this phrase in the last as sort of his prescription, as all these social science books tend to do in the last third, which is faithful presence. And that, I think, it disappointed a lot of people. It felt a little anticlimactic after his magisterial diagnosis, and then just said, you need to be faithfully present. And so, but I am wondering, that is a word people in my kind of world use a lot. And I think it is a good word, or just faithful. I'm wondering, even as you think about your experience stewarding Weave and thinking about that as an agent of culture change and how complex that was and continues to be, do you think, are you at a place even in your own life stage and vocational experience where you think kind of the wisest route may be to stop trying to change things so intentionally at some huge systematic level and rather just choose to figure out how to be faithful to the ethos of a particular profession or our own neighborhood community or our families. And that if something is going to happen at large scale, the right persons will be called to it, and will likely be surprised by when and how it happens? Or is that giving up?
Yeah, I think it's good, but not sufficient, I'd say.
Okay.
And I do think being a faithful presence is not to just fit into the existing institutions, because the existing institutions are in such bad shape. And so, like I mentioned, Tony Kronman used to be dean of the Yale Law School. He wrote a book called The Lost Lawyer, how being a lawyer in the old days was you had to be known for prudence, and there was sort of a dignity to it, that you were supposed to act in a certain way. And now it's just about making money. So if you played the civic role that lawyers used to play, then you would be changing the law because you'd be behaving in ways that are just different. I do think the power of presence, like I mentioned earlier, Jim Lehrer, he was just present being the way he was with a certain set of moral standards, and it was contagious. So I think
it's a good word, contagious.
Yeah, I do think that can be very powerful. And, I cover White Houses, and White Houses are all in the same building and they're all in the same walls, but every White House is very different from every other one. And it's all based on the culture of the people, usually the person at the top. And it just has these powerful radiating lenses. But I do think there has to be organization and structure, and that it's not just to think of, well, I'll be a certain way. I do think you have to create networks of people who share the same cause. And it's that magical community, whether it was the early church or preparing wildly different things, but the Port Huron people. Or another very successful change agent is the Federalist Society, conservative lawyers who started in the 80s to create a network of conservative, really discussion groups. And people wanted to join, and now the Federalist Society basically runs the Supreme Court. And so that's just a massive effort, a movement from the wilderness to the centers of power. And it involved a lot of thought and having a lot of conferences and stuff like that. But it also meant creating sort of a magical community that people wanted to join.
Do you think it's a human thing to be obsessed with change? And I don't mean obsessed in a bad way. Just slight context, just a couple weeks ago, I was in a conversation with our friend Cherie Harder of the Trinity Forum, who Comment has had the privilege of partnering with this past year, and we'll continue to partner with them on some new efforts this coming year, including around this subject of cultural regeneration, which is Cherie's, I think, very kind of helpfully directive phrase. So it's not just change de facto, but what we actually need to know. We need to have a normative view. What do we think is a regenerated culture? And as we were planning essentially an event or a seminar later this year, it occurred to me, and I just sort of said it in the inspiration of the dialogue with my colleague, Ray Pennings. I was like, when we talk about a regenerated culture, it's not like we're trying to go back. This is not an act of nostalgia. Like, we're not trying to go back to some picture of a paint, like a Norman Rockwell painting. That's just like the first stereotypical thing that comes to mind, or some portrait that of children playing in fields and mothers outside with their kids, and just sort of like these standard pictures of how we might think of, like, oh, that is the peaceful, flourishing society. Like, of course we want something along those lines, but we want to be part of movement, and frankly, more specifically, as people of faith, we believe like the Spirit of God is alive and moving. And if there's a sense of absence, there's usually a feeling of stagnancy in a congregation, in a sort of ghosted neighborhood. So stasis is actually not what we're looking for. We don't believe there's some utopia this side of the veil. So I give that background to just ask, are we always going to want to change things? Is that actually just part of what it is to have interior freedom?
Good way to ask that question. The first thing that leaps to mind is their attitudes toward the past can go wrong, in my view, in two ways. The first is the right-wing way, to think we can go back to the past and to be nostalgic for it. And then there's the left-wing way, to think that because the past included a lot of injustices, we have nothing to learn from the past. And in my view, both those tendencies are to be avoided. And so I'm a conservative, and my hero was Edmund Burke. And Burke he was a conservative, the father of conservatism, but it was all about change for him. But it was about, how do you do change? And so he was against revolutionary change, like the French Revolution, or he would have been against the Russian Revolution. The idea that you can tear everything down and start it new. And he says, you're not smart enough. You tear everything down and it'll just turn into anarchy and chaos. And that's what happened in the French Revolution. So his argument was change should be constant, incremental, and gradual. And you should build on the strengths of the old. And so it's those continuities. So over the course of human civilization, we've learned something about family structure. We've learned languages. We've learned traditions and rituals. If your friend dies, it's not automatic that the right thing to do over the next week is host a party every night. And yet Jewish Shiva rituals have people host parties when loved ones have died. And it's a great ritual. It gives them something to do. It gives them community. And it's a way to ease the grief. It's a very sophisticated way of understanding how people process grief. And so those rituals are not to be shoved away. And I would not want to shove away Major League Baseball, or even in its disturbed state, the Republican Party right now, because inherent in these institutions are ancient wisdoms that have stood the test of time, but they always need to be constantly updated. That would be Burke's point, but slowly.
Yeah. And there are moments of violence, I think, in there too. We'll have a debate later about the Republican Party, but offline. Okay. A final question for you, and this is hopefully a uplifting way to end, and maybe a more personal way to end. On On this question of social change, how do you view the role of the transcendent and of the spiritual realm and, frankly, the power of God? And if you have any thoughts there, do you also have reflections on how human beings might cooperate?
Yeah, well, I mean, your theme is Christian humanism. And the first, I think we're driven to change in part by the pain of some injustice. But I think we're also driven by a glorious ideal, and the perfect love of God is movement. And I'm reminded, I keep quoting our friend Christian Wyman in his beautiful book, My Bright Abyss. He said, faith is change, that faith is always on the move, and it's sometimes more doubting and sometimes more fervent, but faith is not a thing that just sits there. And so in one's pursuit of a Christiform life, that's always change, because you're always in pursuit of something you're not going to be completely able to realize. And so I would say that uplifting spirit of yearning is what the soul does and what drives us forward. And then I do think theology, the Bible, gives us models of how to handle the rough parts of change. And that's what made the civil rights movement so tremendously impressive. The awareness that they were on a march. Moses, early Harriet Tubman was called Moses. Martin Luther King talked about the Exodus and Moses more than he talked about the New Testament, frankly. And it gave them a dictionary of how a people can move together, and also a dictionary of how to oppose your enemies without hating them, how not to be corrupted by power, how not to be corrupted by self-righteousness. And so I think the biblical metaphysic gives us the spiritual resources we need to do change well.
Beautiful. David Brooks, thank you so much for joining us. It has been a joy and a little bit of mischief, more than a little bit of mischief, to share you with our listeners. And I'll see you at dinner.
Okay. I believe that another institution, the Institution of Marriage. And while our marriage change, I hope our marriage partners never do.
Amen. Adios.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Whole Person Revolution. Check out this podcast's cultural and theological seedbed at www.comet.org, where you'll find imagination for a thriving society animated by the Christian humanist tradition, including regular writing by Alan Jacobs and other literary luminaries, The Welcome Table hosted by Greg Thompson, Zealots at the Gate, a feisty new podcast about religion and democracy featuring Shadi Hamid and Matthew Koenig, and a whole lot more. And consider getting involved in our growing Comet community. You can write, you can read, you can host a Comet supper in your neighborhood, or you can participate in a conversation with your fellow readers and an author. We want to equip you to be an agent of renewal in our time, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at podcasts@comet.org and expect a substantive exchange. We're honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comet Magazine, edited by Becca Bruder, produced and with original music by Ali Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder, and I'll see you next week.